Yep. Do you want to start with Nathan? Yep.
Name's Nathan Charles Cornell, and I'm an applicant for Street to Home.
Glenda Stevens, Chief Executive Officer of Homelessness Australia.
Adrian Pisarski, the Executive Officer of National Shelter.
Carol Croce, Executive Director, Community Housing Federation of Australia.
Fantastic. And look, thank you all for appearing before the committee today. And I know it's the second time that many of you have appeared as witnesses before this inquiry. I'm very conscious of the fact there's a fair few questions from different senators, but before we get to that, and conscious of the fact that we are quite short for time because it is a Senate sitting day, wondering if you'd like to begin by making any kind of opening remarks or an opening statement.
Is it my turn to go? I'm Glenda Stevens, Chief Executive Officer of Homelessness Australia. My organisation consists of 3 founding member groups: the Council for Homeless Persons Australia, National Youth Coalition for Housing, Women's Services Network. Homelessness Australia was started by the Howard Government to be a single, clear voice in the homelessness sector at a national level. This morning I'm going to speak about the importance of peak bodies and specifically about Homelessness Australia. Homelessness Australia performs 6 key roles. We provide informed policy advice to government, sector development, community awareness and education. We act as a two-way conduit for information between the homelessness sector and government. We develop key resources for use by the sector and provide strategic input into committees and other organisations. A peak body is a non-government organisation with membership of entities with allied interests, and it offers a sturdy voice for those entities. They provide a one-stop shop for government and the sector to share information, and they conduct cost-effective research and development. HA is a peak body with a broad membership base that includes large national multi-focus providers, as well as small local services like Doris, which is a women's refuge here in Canberra. This diversity of members enables HA to identify trends and challenges faced by the sector from small through to large organisations. Importantly, given that HA is not a sector provider and that our membership is broad and diverse, the advice and information we provide to government and others is without bias. Peak bodies are a value for money method for the government to reach the sector and to hear back about how programs and initiatives are working in practice. Homelessness Australia represents most of the 1,300 different organisations and is regularly in contact with them through written and oral communications. It would be impractical for government agencies to interact individually with these organisations. HA facilitates the two-way flow of information. As well as DSS information, HA has disseminated details for the Royal Commission into Institutional Child Abuse and the current review of Federation. The December announcement to return housing and homelessness, service improvement and sector support funding to government surplus is causing significant turmoil and uncertainty in the sector. This decision has been made prior to the Federation White Paper process, which is purposefully looking at housing and homelessness, and the decision may very well undermine that strategic approach of the Federation process. Decisions in the homelessness sector need to be made through a whole-of-government lens, rather than through seeking short-term, small financial savings for budget. The removal of Homelessness Australia, CHUFA and National Shelter will create an unfillable vacuum. Given the nature of the tender process, we are unable to ascertain the full extent of other valuable sector improvements that have been foregone. Those that we know of are a significant loss. We provide a broad view of the state of the sector, a synthesised version of our members' diverse perspectives and interests. We provide aggregated information so that the government can get a clear picture of the sector as a whole. Through policy development and advocacy, we provide systemic analysis, wide community engagement. We contribute to positive public outcomes and build the capacity of the sector and its workforce to provide best practice frontline services. Without Homelessness Australia, the department and the sector would lose the long-term strategic relationships that we have built up since our creation in 1998. HA conducts numerous media interviews on homelessness and contributes to a diverse range of publications. Our Homeless Persons Week raises community awareness and understanding and increases community connections for services. Our 16 days of advocacy highlighted the interdependence between domestic violence and homelessness. Our sector development work has included hosting Australia's only homelessness-focused not-for-profit conference. With Beyond Blue, we have developed a toolkit for use by workers to identify depression and anxiety. We collaborated with NISA and developed materials to support better interactions between employment and homelessness services. Last year, HA provided a homelessness voice to public submissions to government inquiries, such as the McClure Welfare Review. We represented the sector into 15 strategically selected reference groups. We met with 8 federal ministers and 21 federal politicians. HA also supports the sector through analysis and briefings on research and government policy. More than 20 such reports were produced last year. For a minimal cost, HA effectively and efficiently works towards preventing and ending homelessness. We support the organisations and people who are supporting their clients as they rebuild their lives and re-engage with the wider community. I now turn to another important homelessness funding issue, the National Partnership Agreement on Homelessness. Initially a 4-year agreement, the NPAH has now been extended annually, twice, and it is due to expire in June this year. This agreement needs to be extended with guaranteed funding until after the Federation White Paper process has been completed. The funding from this agreement allows vital frontline services to be provided at a relatively low cost to the government to those with extreme needs. The Street to Home program is an example of the important frontline work that is funded through the NPAH. Street to Home is a national program and is delivered by the St Vincent de Paul here in the ACT. I have here with me today Nathan. He's gone from sleeping rough through transitional housing and recently has been more permanently accommodated in affordable public housing. Now Nathan has used the Street to Home program. He's going to tell the committee some of his story. It will provide you with a taste of the life-changing work that programs such as Street to Home provide to people across Australia. Nathan.
There you go. I was homeless for 8 years nearly before I found out about Street to Home. I was sleeping in a tent out in the bush for a few years, and if I didn't meet up with Street to Home, I'd probably be still there. And yeah, well, I don't really know what else I could say. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question, Mr. Quinnell?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
How did you find out about Street to Home?
Through another person that was actually homeless.
Right.
He gave me a phone number to ring, and
were you connected with Centrelink during that time you were living in the tent?
yes.
Yep. And did they talk to you about?
No, I didn't really tell too many people about it
Yeah.
because I was a bit embarrassed at the times.
Understand.
No.
And in terms of the work that Street to Home did with you, do you want to tell us the sort of like the pathway that you went from being really very homeless to now housed?
Well, they set me up in a transitional home for a while just to make sure that I can sustain myself, and they just helped me get into public housing.
Right.
Over what period of time was that, Mr.
It's been 12 months now that they've been working with me, and they've done such great.
So from the time that you picked up the phone to the time that you were to the time that you were in housing, how long?
12 months, sir.
Yeah, right. Okay, so you were a transition period, and how long ago was that?
Well, I still work with Street to Home today, and it's been like, it was 12 months.
Yeah, and you've been in public housing for about 6 weeks now.
Yeah, I've been in public housing now for 6 weeks.
Congratulations. Well done.
Thank you. Well, without programs like Street to Home, people like, who want to change their lives from what they were.
Many like you? You got.
Yes, I've actually met a few around my age group that are homeless, and it's a more common thing nowadays.
That's good. Sorry, Jan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Quinnell. We may come back to you with
you're
other
right,
questions
thank you.
later.
Did you want to, on behalf of National Shelter, make an opening statement as well? Do you want to? Yep.
I would like to make a brief opening statement. Thanks, Senator. Adrian Pisarski, the Executive Officer of National Shelter. Just briefly about National Shelter itself, we are partly a federated body of state organisations and partly made up of national members, two of which are Homelessness Australia and CHUFA. We represent in the broad many thousands of organisations nationwide and individuals. Our membership tends to be either services that work with tenants or housing organisations, but also extends into the mental health, drug and alcohol, planners, architects. We have quite a diverse membership base through the shelter network. But what we seek to do is represent the concerns of consumers within the housing system, and particularly to focus on the shortage of affordable housing in Australia and how at a policy and program level that can be improved and addressed. So we get very modest funding from government through to June 30, and I think the level of it is insignificant in terms of budget repair measures. And I think if the government is very serious about its new consultative attitude, it needs to go beyond just consulting with backbenchers, even though they are very important, and I would recognise that. But it also needs to show that it has a connection with the community. And peak bodies like ours, who have very little recourse to private sources of finance from our membership base, many of whom have funding from government themselves which is restricted in what they can spend it on, and do not have spare resources, dedicate their resources to direct service delivery, rely on government therefore to support peak bodies so that they have forums through which they can express their views and the views of the consumers of all of those services. We've been around for about 40 years, and I think National Shelter is one of those organisations, along with my colleagues on either side of me, that represent civil society at its best in Australia. Without government support for civil society organisations, the country will be poorer, our policy discussions and program discussions will be poorer, and governments will not get the best advice they can from the broad cross-section of community, and won't have the conduit into the sector as a two-way process from our sector to government and from government to our sector about new directions. I just want to make a couple of other points, and the first one relates to the reform of the federation process. It seems to me that these decisions to axe not just our peaks but the whole housing and homelessness program out of the DSS funding preempts decisions that could emerge from the reform of the federation process. Since this government has come to power, they have ended the Housing Ministers' Council, dismantled the Housing Ministers' Advisory Conference, have ended the National Housing Supply Council, have slashed the National Rental Affordability Scheme, and now have removed all housing and homelessness funding from the Department of Social Services. It seems to me that that is a pattern which signals the government's intention to completely withdraw from housing and homelessness funding, which will leave the whole country a lot worse off and represent essentially a massive cost shift to the states and to local government and to the community sector, who end up through their charitable work picking up the pieces of failed government and market policies. Affordable housing in Australia is a market failure, and it's something that the national government has recognised it has a responsibility to intervene in over the last 70 years. That's most of the federation process. It seems to me that we are signalling an intent to get out of that area of policy, and that would be a tragedy. And I would encourage this committee to make that point well known to government, and I'll leave my opening remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Mrs. Crochet, did you want to make an opening statement as well?
Yep. Again, my name is Carol Crochet. I'm the Executive Director for the Community Housing Federation of Australia. Usually when you're the third person on the panel, you get to just say what they said. But I wanted to add a couple things. First of all, my organization represents community housing providers, and we are the ones who are at the forefront of delivering more affordable housing. We're also involved in the renewal of existing social housing and also meeting some of the new demands that are coming out in terms of people who are coming through the NDIS program and trying to provide housing. What CHUFA does, as most peak bodies, we support the growth and the capacity building of the sector to meet those demands, and the defunding of our organization really undercuts our ability to do that. I just wanted to briefly talk about what I think is lost when you terminate funding for a peak body, and give you some specific examples. Oftentimes, I think when people talk about peak bodies, they think of us as what we bring to the public debate from our sector, which we do. But I think people forget that we're also a conduit for the government to promote their agenda as much as it is to hear voices from the sector. For example, under stakeholder engagement. The reason why stakeholder engagement works so well when it's peak bodies, and particularly with our organization, is because the sector trusts us. They know that the information that we're going to provide is going to reflect their views. And by the same token, the government is also confident that the kinds of information we're going to be providing about their policies is also accurate, so that you get a really good fit. Two quick examples. We did consultations with NRAS providers several years ago, 150 of them in fact, and from that got recommendations on where they saw problems with the programs, where they thought changes could be made, and what their goals and challenges were. And that information was passed on, and we saw changes made. We also recently have done a paper, and I've got a pack that I'd like to present to the committee, about looking at housing for people with disabilities. With the beginning of the national, with the NDIS, we know that we need to provide housing, and what that report did was provide a blueprint for what government needs to do to be able to build the capacity so that there is housing for people with disabilities who are coming into the program. I dare say that that's not the kind of engagement you would get from a group like KPMG. Research function is another one that all of our organizations provide, and by the defunding really decimates this essential level of expertise that our organizations provide to all governments, and they use that information in order to form policy. For example, some of the research we've recently done is looking at what's the impact or the importance of Commonwealth rent assistance to the community housing sector, why it's a vital subsidy, and what are the things that will be lost if that's removed. We also did another one on allocations and rent setting. And in light of the housing, the stock transfers that are going on, it's really important to make sure that we avoid some of the mistakes that have happened in terms of rent setting for in the public housing system. Again, you need that information if you're going to be making policy. And again, not to invoke KPMG, but I don't think you get it at the same price as you get for funding a peak organization. As Adrian said, it's really quite a modest amount of information. A modest amount of money. Sorry, information. Massive amount of information, modest amount of money. And the last, I guess, is about government consultation. What you also get is you get a national perspective, and you're able then to articulate the differences within different providers in different jurisdictions. And you get that if you've got a broad framework to work from. And it's also a way to be able to give ideas for setting policy. I'm going to really tout ourselves on this one. When we were looking at the national regulatory system, there was a set of different options. This is for the community housing sector, on a number of different options on how we might progress that. We talked to the sector, who said none of those options really work for us. So our organization put forward a different option, and that's actually the option that was used, and that has been the groundwork, and that's been the framework for the national regulatory system. I guess what I'm trying to say is you really do get value for money, and that it seems that the defunding is really quite a short-sighted activity that works against a more longer-term, productive, cooperative relationship between government and the peaks.
Okay, thank you. Well, look, I know there's a fair few questions from senators. I only had one question myself, and I know there's going to be a fair few questions about the funding and the defunding of these organisations. So I was going to ask something slightly separate. I think it's, and Nathan, thank you so much for coming, and thank you for participating in our inquiry. Thank you for coming and kind of sharing your story and kind of giving a real example of the kinds of works that these organisations do. I guess part of the question I'd like to ask, perhaps it's to you, Ms. Stevens, but I'm sure the others can answer as well, It sounds like the story that Nathan told us was a story about him being connected with the right agency and the right organisation was able to put him through the right program to be able to help him, which is obviously part of the challenge. But how much is that the challenge, and how much is also the challenge is the sheer shortage? Because what the evidence we've been kind of getting as part of the inquiry is it's not just, yes, it's important to have good programs that put the right people in touch with the right services, but fundamentally there is especially in crisis housing, a real shortage problem, which is at the heart of it as well. So I just wouldn't mind if you touch on not just the connection problem, but the actual supply problem.
I would say that Institute of Health and Welfare did some every year do a report, and in their report at the end of December last year, there was about 400. Every day, about 400 cases are closed in homelessness services around the country, and of those 400, 67% have a positive housing outcome. So the others are closed because of other reasons, but the point is that they don't get housing.
Senator, it's an important question. You would have heard much evidence about the massive housing supply shortfall that Australia has, and particularly at the affordable end. It's estimated by the National Housing Supply Council in its last report that is a massive number. I can't even remember the number.
185,000.
No, the 185,000 was the shortfall of properties overall, but it's something like 253,000 shortfall of supply to the affordable end of the market. I guess, though, the point that I want to make is that our services and the services that we represent and the advice that we give to government actually makes a difference. I've been in this broad policy area now working for over 35 years. For at least the last 15 or 20 years in my memory, the homelessness number in Australia has hovered around about 100,000, and we always use this figure and talk about how terrible it is, and it is a terrible number in terms of the level of homelessness. But relative to the population, it has been going down, despite the fact that our levels of public housing and social housing overall have not been going up. There is something about what we have been doing and advising governments through new programs, different directions, etc., that actually works and has been keeping that number stable whilst population has been growing. Now, that's not to say that we've solved it. We're a long way short of solving it, and more affordable housing is required, and there are broader government policies that need to be addressed. It is not at the welfare end of the spectrum that you solve this problem. It is in tax policy, it is in the future of federal-state relationships, it is in urban policy, public transport policy. All of those things need to come together to actually address that massive shortfall of affordability that we need. And we work at all of those levels, and one of the points that I did want to make was that we don't only work within the welfare sector, we actually work across the whole spectrum. We work with the private sector, with governments at all levels, and with whoever we can get our hands on, institutes of accountants and planners and so on and so forth. We are in there discussing with them ways of addressing these problems in the long run. This is a very good return for a very modest level of government investment.
And I would agree with everything that Adrian said, with one slight exception, and it was about the growth in social housing. The community housing sector is the one sector where they are delivering and are providing more housing on the ground in the affordable housing area and in the social housing area. So trying to meet that. But in order to do that, you need to have the right kind of policy levers in place in order for the sector to be able to have the capacity to grow, to be able to work with all the organizations Adrian just talked about, the planners, the developers. And that's what a peak body is able to do, is able to provide that information to enable the government to do appropriate government policy development and working with them. And that's the kind of things that you lose when you don't have a peak body there to do it.
Senator Lucas?
Thank you. Thank you all for coming again, but particularly Mr. Quinnell, thank you for coming to join us today. Can I just get sort of some of the nuts and bolts of what happened just before Christmas? What advices were you provided prior to the 23rd of December when you received, I understand, confirm that, a letter from the department informing them that your funding would cease on 30th of June. What did you hear from the department prior to receiving that letter?
I think it may differ from organisation to organisation. We received a phone call on Monday, I believe that was the 21st, but the letter, the actual formal letter, didn't arrive until January. So just so that's clear.
You had a phone call from the department?
From the department, yes.
Just to go back to the start of the announcement of the funding round when it was first announced, because this was a new approach for the department in terms of how it was going to allocate its funding. It was putting everything as we understood it on the table. The very first question that I asked the department at that time was, would it affect our ongoing contract? We had a contract from 2013 through to 16. I asked the department if it would affect our contract. The answer I got was no, it would not affect our contract. Our contract was outside of this grants round. So that was our understanding going into the grants round. We actually applied for some enhancement to our funding through the grants, and also for support for a specific project around the development of a rental affordability index, which we think is a missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle in terms of the data. So then I got the phone call 2 days prior to Christmas from 3 officials from the department. At the time, I was cooking breakfast for 9 of my relatives. I remember being slightly hungover, having celebrated Christmas the night before, and had to abandon all of our plans for the next couple of days to convene meetings of our committee and whatnot. So it was a very abrupt notice. We appreciate that the department provided it to us as early as possible, and that was a good thing, because it did allow us a little bit more time to inform our members and whatnot. But it was very sudden and quite crushing in a way, coming just as it did before Christmas. And we received electronically a letter the same day, and subsequently a letter by post.
Ms. Stevens?
We're a slightly different scenario that we went through the process like everybody else. We had, prior to the when the new way of working was announced, we attended presentations. We took the information that the government provided to us, disseminated it to all our service providers who are members. We helped them with their applications ourselves. We put in applications for sector development projects, as well as our National Secretariat. All up, that probably took about 4 weeks of solid work for a staff member, being me. On the Monday the 21st, I received a phone call in the office just to say that the funding had been withdrawn and returned to government savings, and it would not be going ahead. No reason except that it was part of a MyEFA decision. We have not received any letter or anything about that, etc. Being slightly different in that our funding was not being renewed. Yesterday afternoon, the department dropped in some paperwork for our funding, which has been extended to the end of this financial year. That's the only paperwork we've received.
And if I could just add, we're in a similar situation to National Shelter in that we too have a contract, or had a contract that ran until June of 2016, and had been told that our funding was outside of that round. We had put in some other applications for some projects through the DSS funding round, and just to be on the safe side, we had put in for funding past 2016. If you remember or recall, the DSS funding round was for a period of 4 to 5 years, and so that was but that was more of a safety or a precautionary measure. But we were really quite taken by surprise in that we had no inkling that our current funding was in jeopardy.
Just for the record, can you give the committee the quantum of the ongoing funding that you had been receiving and expected in the case of Chufa and Shelter?
For us is $325,000 per year.
And for National Shelter, $150,000 per year plus GST.
We were receiving about $250,000 a year.
Do you want to say
No. What I say probably couldn't be recorded in Hansard. Carry on.
Since the announcement, have any of your organisations sought meetings with the Minister?
I think we have certainly written to the Minister requesting a meeting. I followed that up with a minister's advisor and did get a meeting with a ministerial advisor last week and have pressed the case for a meeting with the minister himself.
Similar, we wrote and requested a meeting with the minister just after the announcement, rather the announcement of the new minister. I, in the new year, contacted the office trying to get a meeting with either the minister or his advisor who had yet been appointed, and was told that they would contact me when they were ready. I met his advisor this morning and we shall meet shortly.
Similar. We've put in a letter to Minister Morrison requesting a meeting and welcoming him to the portfolio, and have met with the housing advisor, his housing advisor.
Okay. And meetings with the department officials. Have you had meetings with, on this matter, not on separate matters, but on the funding issue?
When the phone call came through, I must say the members of the department were very, very nice and pleasant about it all. And they were very open, offered their phone number for contact at any time. I did phone them a few times and had questions, and then I went with them, and we had an open discussion, and the phone line is still there and they're very open to discussion. And
same with us. I mean, after the department called, and again, I would agree with Glenda, we're very helpful, and I have to say, because it was not a phone call I was expecting. I had questions that I didn't know I had yet, and had talked to them later that day, and have subsequently had meetings with the department.
Mm-hmm. We've had a couple of subsequent conversations to clarify some points. One of the issues I think now is that the staffing within DSS has changed very rapidly, so many of those people who we were and had developed relationships with are no longer in those same positions. There's one consistent staff member from the group of staff that we were talking to previously.
That's true.
Can I go now to the contract that both Chilfa and Shelter, you didn't have an ongoing contract housing with Homelessness Australia, Ms Stevens, did you? But the contracts that Shelter and Chilfa had, you've had a good look at those, I dare say, and they were contracts that were signed in good faith by your organisations to the end of June 2016. Is there a get-out clause, or I mean, what's the ability for a department to say, or a government, I won't say department, a government, to say, you've got a document that is an agreement between two entities, but we're about to break our bit of it? Have you had a look at the contract?
We took legal advice as well. There is a clause in the standard terms and conditions for all standard funding agreements across the Australian government, Clause 22, I'm very familiar with it now, which does allow the government, when there is no fault of the recipient, to be able to terminate a contract.
Without reason?
Yeah, wording to that effect.
Same. And final question, and I'll pass over to colleagues. All three of you have talked about the very unique representative role that you have, and that it is a two-way. I think all of you use the word conduit. That it was information up and down, and that you provided that service. You all talked about the fact that you represent large numbers of service providers. So, without your organisations being in the policy landscape, what other organisations can fill that communication void?
I'm not aware of other organisations that can fill that void. There are other peak bodies like ACOS, but having served on the board of ACOS for a number of years, I know that ACOS itself is reliant on having specific sector peak bodies to provide it with the broad advice that it needs to consider in its policy advice to government, and it would find it very difficult without our organisations to have ongoing policy in these areas. And I don't know of any other organisations who would be capable of providing that two-way conduit.
Okay. Just before we go to Senator Ludlam and Senator Canavan, I am conscious there's quite a few questions from different senators, which I'm obviously happy to go to, but just pointing out to the senators that if we do run over as a result, we will be eating into time from the Department of Social Services because we have to be finishing.
That's a fair point. How much time do you guys need?
I mean, if you guys want to take a few minutes
I'm
of that
happy to
time for
split it
later,
up.
that's fine. We'll take a few bit of department time, but just
I've had a few. All right. Okay. Thanks very much, Chair.
take a bit of department time.
Yeah,
rather
no,
than
that's
more.
no worries. Thanks all for being here, and I just want to thank you, I guess, collectively for your input to this committee to date. And I suspect when the final report's written, we'll realise that the information and expertise you've provided us with is all through the report. Just want to underline the value that you've provided to inquiries like this now and in the past. I think you fleshed out quite effectively the role that you play. I'm interested to know what happens from here. I think, maybe we're now in day 2 of good government, day 3, how time flies, and more open, consultative, listening government. So I am actually going to express some hope that we can have this absurd decision reversed. If it's not, just tell us what happens between now and the end of the financial year for your 3 organisations. What does it actually look like?
Well, for National Shelter, we still have a project to complete, and we're in negotiation with the department about slightly revising that project plan. It won't now be able to be done to the same level as we would have done it, and that project is actually looking at rent setting policy. We will still complete the project because we're contracted to do that, but we won't probably be able to do it as thoroughly as we would have liked to. Beyond June 30, we face a future with no money. And the organisation is considering a strategy to see how we might be able to cobble together some alternative sources of funding, but I could not say with any confidence that we will be able to secure any funding, and the most likely scenario is that Shelter will not have any staff beyond June 30 next year, and at 58, as I now am, that's a pretty scary prospect individually.
For the Community Housing Federation, we've been in the process of moving from a federated body to a single industry body that would be membership driven. This is a process that we have apprised all of the ministers. We've been doing this for the last several years, and also the department. We were on track to move, and have been on track to move into that with a change in our constitution starting the beginning of July. However, that was predicated on the idea that there would be funding for a national office to continue all of the policy work we do. Without the funding, we are in the process of closing the Canberra office. I would say about half of my time is spent doing that. The other half is fulfilling our requirements under our existing contract. That puts 3 staff people out of work by the end of June. I do believe that our organization will continue, but in a very limited capacity, and I'm really unclear about how we will continue to do any of the types of industry body activities that have to do with the policy development and working with government. It'll be mostly focused on membership services, which is not really what the purpose of us combining our resources was.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose I'd like to say that at the moment, like the other 2 organisations, we're working on how to look at our own future instead of working on what we really should be doing, which is building sector capacity and giving good information to the community and to government. So it's all this whole process has taken so much time and energy away from what we really should be doing. It's such a waste. So at the moment, we're looking at a very uncertain future. We do have a small amount of resources, so I'm doing a lot of time doing financial models, trying to figure out how to best eke out the little bit of resources we have to stay afloat as long as possible, looking at where we start shedding staff. We only have a staff of 4, so where do we start putting people off, etc., to see how long we actually can stay afloat to do the job that we think needs to be done, because there is actually nobody else to do it.
I think when you were going through before what your annual funding is, it came cumulatively to less than $1 million a year.
That's correct.
If the government waits until the budget, the May budget, to reverse this decision, what will have been the impact on your organisations between now and then, if they wait till that late in the cycle?
A real loss of, I think, as Glenda put it, attention on the policy and program issues and the conduit process that we provide, and a focus on our own internal survival, which is obviously what happens to any organisation when they are faced with a threat to their resource base.
I think the loss of trust is quite significant, and trust of us to government, but also the uneasiness within the sector. With at least every day we have a member ringing up saying, do we renew our membership fees? Are you going to be here? Yeah. So whilst most of our money is government funding, we do get some from our membership, but already that's being put in jeopardy.
And that would be the same for CHUFA as well.
It's a member-based organisation.
Yeah. It would be the same thing in terms of what happens after June, what happens in terms of the policy development. We have a number of projects that were in train. Are they continuing? Participation in processes. We've got a national housing conference coming up. I mean, there's a good example of national housing conference, and there's 3 main peaks that have played an important part in that. And I don't think any of us will be participating.
I maybe might ask, because we're a bit short on time, I'd like to give coalition senators some opportunities as well. If you could provide with us on notice, as long as it's not too much work, just a breakdown from each of you, how many staff are involved, whether you're going to be in trouble re-signing leases or other contracts and that kind of stuff, just what this train wreck actually looks like, if that's possible. Mr. Quinnell, I'd like to also thank you for coming in this morning. I know it's a bit of a strange setting for a conversation like this, but we hear a lot from the organisations on the front line. I found it really valuable in Perth as well to hear from people who had actually experienced it themselves, so thanks. You'd be familiar with the work that these guys do probably better than anybody. What's your message to the government this morning, having experienced homelessness directly and having heard what these people are being put through?
Well, by my personal experience is, if they did cut the funding or whatever, it's going to be a lot harder for people to get back in if they really want to get off the streets and stuff like that, homeless. It would probably impact a lot. Maybe crime would go up and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Because that's what, in the long run, that's what you end up resort to, to survive. And it's not the way we should be living. That's about it.
Yeah. Thanks for speaking with us this morning. Thanks, Chair.
Could I just add one quick thing, and it was about in relationship to Senator Ludland's comment about some of the things around leases. In the situation for CHUFA and for National Shelter, and it's a part of Clause 22 in the terms and conditions, there is a clause that provides for the government to pay reasonable costs incurred as a result of this action, and I know we are in negotiation about trying to get some of those things covered, like do we have contracts that extend past the 30th that we're going to have to honor, things about staff entitlements and redundancy. So there is some leeway for that. But that's not the case for Homelessness Australia.
I know my committee is currently taking industrial advice about the nature of my contract and the claim against that, and whether that will subsequently be claimed as a reasonable cost. I never try and be too confident about that. For National Shelter, it's a pretty simple equation. We only have one permanent employee, and that's me. I work from home, so there's very little overhead.
Okay, good premises and stuff. What a train wreck. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just, I might start from a bit more of a base level, because I don't have a lot of familiarity with this area. I mean, in our notes, it says the government saved $21 million from this decision. So how is that made up exactly? Can anyone tell me, or do I have to ask the department? Okay, so can I just get again, and I might have missed it, exactly how much are we talking from Homelessness Australia there, Ms Stevens, from the government?
I think I said 250 million. Actually, it's 350,000.
350 per year?
Per year, yes.
And yourself, Mr.
150.
Sorry?
150.
150.
And 325.
325 all per year. Okay. Mr. Stevens, I'm going through your annual report, and you spend about, well, last year I think you spent about $1.26 million a year. Is that right?
If that's what's in the annual report,
Okay.
yes.
And that had been a significant increase from 2012. Do you know why? Like there was a 500,000 increase in your expenses from 12 to 13?
Yes, it was to do with the hosting of the national conference.
Okay, is it a biannual thing?
It's a biannual conference,
okay,
yes.
Right, no problems. And so that the 350 from the government for your organisation, I mean, I know your expenditures might jump up and down, but what percentage of that, sort of a 5-year period, is that of your overall
The
budget?
5-year period, basically our income is about that 350, plus we, through the grants round, we have received some funding to help with the conference, and separately another small amount of money for 25,000 for Homeless Persons Week. We've received that over the last couple of years, and about 80,000 in membership fees. So the government funding, if you added those three pieces together, it makes up about 90% of our
90%.
income.
And but this decision only affects 350.
That's correct.
So
the separate you asked earlier about where the other 21 million, they were separate applications.
Right.
This is just the National Secretariat funding,
Okay.
which is for the organisation. The others were for projects.
So does this decision only affect $350,000 of your?
No, it would it has affected all the applications we put in for all our
discretionary grants
separate
above and beyond the permanent funding.
Yes.
Okay, right. Okay. I also saw in your annual report you've got more than $1 million in the bank as well. Is that correct?
No, it's not that much. It's
Okay, I'll just bring it up here in your annual report. Your balance sheet, it says cash and cash equivalents of 1.0113.
And that was at the end of the last financial year?
End of 2013?
Yeah. It's, a lot of that is to do with timing, cycling of when the funding comes in, and so that would be in advance, payments in advance.
Yeah, end of 2012 you had $814,000 in the bank as well?
At the moment we have about 800,000 in the bank.
Oh, you have about 800,000 in the bank. So the 350 that's immediately been taken off, you've got a little bit of water there to.
We do, as I said earlier, we have some funds, and we're figuring out how to best use those.
Okay, Mr. Pisaki, I didn't see an annual report on but you're only a one-man organisation. You don't do an annual report, or?
No, we do an annual
report.
report.
I just couldn't. I must have been able to find it on your website.
No, we do one. Our membership fees are about $25,000 a year,
right.
And we receive tiny amounts of additional money beside that, but it's really insignificant. Our whole strategy over the last number of years is to have as lean a national secretariat as well as we possibly can. We do some work through our state organisations who take on specific projects from time to time, and for many years I'd point out, when I was the executive officer of Queensland Shelter, Queensland Shelter received something like $1 million a year in funding. Through that whole period of time when I was there, I used to spend about 60% of my time from running Queensland Shelter supporting the national organisation. So our resources vary around those sorts of equations. Those things are no longer possible because all state governments will no longer tolerate that kind of situation. I had a particularly strong relationship with the Queensland State Government through all of those years, who could see the benefit of allowing me as the Executive Officer of Queensland Shelter to operate at the national level as well, and supported me to do that. So in lots of ways the Queensland Government supported National Shelter's operation for a long time, but we're no longer in that situation. So the funding that we receive from the federal government is virtually everything that we use to survive on and to do our work.
And do you have cash at bank that you could, at the moment you're not in the same
virtually
position as
nothing.
Stevens,
we would have something like, well, we've probably got about $200,000 in the bank at the moment, but of that, at least 120 of that will have disappeared by the end of the financial year, and the rest is reserves that have been built up over 40 years. That's a long time to build up only 80,000. You might criticise us for our financial management, but we've had very lean years for most of that period.
Okay. And Ms. Croce, you're a large organisation, is that right? Or I don't know.
We're 3 people, 2.5 staff.
Okay, all right. So what percentage of your funding is affected by this decision?
Excuse me?
What percentage of your funding is affected?
It's close to, it'd probably be about 90%.
90%.
We get some membership fees of around 20,000. Peak bodies until recently were not allowed to provide funding from their state funds towards a national body. We had last year we'd had a one-off contract to do training with that was provided by the Commonwealth and states to do training on the national regulatory system. We've in the past done a couple of conferences that we've lost money on. And in fact, our reserves have, until recently, have been quite lean. The 325 I quoted was part of a triennial agreement. Up until then, our funding was considerably less. It was $80,000 less than that. There's documentation that we've provided over the last 10 years to the department that we have had to dip into our reserves and actually to meet our contractual obligations for our DSS funding. And this was part of trying to, we didn't get indexed, we didn't get increased. In fact, we got less money than other peak bodies of our size. So the point I'm making is our reserves had dwindled very significantly, and it's only been in the last, well, since the beginning of this contract, so it'll be about a year, 18 months, we've been able to at least put aside some of the non-DSS money that we have. So we're in a pretty difficult situation financially.
And can I just clarify exactly what is the money used for right now? That you've got about 800,000 here that you've mentioned directly is gone. Is that just to help you survive as an organisation with overhead costs, etc.?
That's correct.
Okay. And then the grants funding on top of that is obviously for specific projects of some kind. Are those projects solely, I know you do a lot of research, Ms. Stevens, are they solely research based, or do you provide frontline services to people? Or?
They're research projects and sector capacity building projects. We did a project with Beyond Blue called Tune In Now, which was about, we built a online resource for homeless services workers so they can identify depression and anxiety in their clients, which was an early intervention program. We combined with NISA and developed a program which worked between homelessness services and employment services, so they had better communications. So about building sector development so workers can do their job better.
Okay. So do you interface, or I'm asking this for everybody at the table, do any of your organisations interface directly with people like Mr. Cornell and provide them services in terms of getting them into a home, or are you just an umbrella organisation as such?
We support the organisations that
support Mr. Cornell.
Yeah.
So I suppose in terms of going forward, and Ms. Croce, you mentioned specifically, KPMG being an alternative to do some of your type of work. What about the department itself providing these services? Presumably they can organise conferences, they can facilitate advice to the minister. Would that be a more efficient way to...
If they're providing advice to the minister, I would argue, what is it based on? Unless they're going out to the sector to find out what the issues are, then they would be operating in a vacuum, and I don't think that's...
Well, that should be their job. If there's a policy, I mean, they should be doing it anyway.
But the way they do I would argue that the way they do their job and have done it well, we've had a very good collegial relationship for years through several different governments, is that you go to the peak bodies to be able to work with them to develop, to look at what's kind of information that we need, that we're lacking here in government to be able to make an informed policy decision. What can we do together to try and gather that information? So that's how they go out and get that information.
I'd also add 2 points. You, as a principle, don't develop the not-for-profit sector out of government. The independence of the not-for-profit sector must be supported by its own sector. And the other point I'd make is that the department has just gotten rid of or redeployed all of the staff from those sections, so it actually wouldn't have the capacity itself to do those things anymore.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just perhaps following up on that, and Ms Stevens, you wrote to me on the 9th of February, and I presume other senators as well, talking about the NPAH. And,
yes.
And you, in that letter, you referred to this figure of $21.13 million in government savings that had been were in homelessness services, and that came about due to the cancelling of the Homelessness and Housing DSS grant. Can you just perhaps elaborate, perhaps, and it might be a more long-term thing, how does this impact on the homeless, the withdrawal of this funding, which is, that's a considerable amount of money?
It is a considerable amount of money. You've heard that our 3 organisations were not refunded. The one organisation that was refunded was Ahuri, so $6 million did go to out of that $21 million went to Ahuri, I think for until 2017, and then that stops. Pardon me. We don't know what else has been foregone because we're not privy to what has gone through the department. It's at the moment, still very quiet and very closed. Through our discussions with service providers and others in the sector, things like the Geelong project, which is a very, very successful early intervention program that was developed in Geelong, and it was set to be rolled out in New South Wales and northern beaches of Sydney and in Brisbane as well. That's now in jeopardy. There's a sector magazine called Parity, which is run by Council for Homeless Persons in Victoria. That's also in jeopardy. They're going to now change the way they produce the magazine. Instead of being a paper magazine, will probably be online, which is, as you know, with magazines, is not as successful as a paper one. My staff have sort of gathered together a list. 14 community legal centres in Victoria who work mainly with domestic violence. They've been defunded. Talking Realities, which is a program which involves teenage parenting classes, that's gone or never got off the ground. So they're projects that all large and small organisations from around the country had sought funding for, variety of natures. The long-term effect will be that it will affect the ability of services to support people like Nathan to make his experience of homelessness as short as possible and to make their work as efficient as possible. So if we take it right back to basics, it affects the front line. It affects rehousing families, people from domestic violence, single men, older people. Everybody who's affected by homelessness will be affected by this decision, short and long term.
I'd make the additional point, Senator, that I've been hearing from services in Queensland. I still sit on a couple of local committees up there that had applied for funding that they had been previously receiving and had been notified that they were successful in being a preferred provider, but were now being offered up only a fifth of the funding that they had been previously provided with to do the same service. So their capacity, I think, will be affected in the overall grants round decision. But I'd also make the point that our services and peak bodies have been at the forefront, along with many others. We don't operate in isolation, we work with our sector, but we were at the forefront of developing a reform agenda both in the affordable housing and homelessness areas that has been now running for 5 or 6 years. I think these decisions really threaten that reform agenda, and I'm really fearful of where that reform agenda is now headed within the reform of the Federation process as well. I think that's the really serious problem that we face, that we now are putting at risk that whole reform of affordable housing and homelessness service provision, which I think was demonstrating real success.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I think just one or two questions, Senator Edwards.
I just want to try and get my head around this. The states and territories are responsible, aren't they, for determining the priorities and the flexibility to decide and how they should be funded. What advice do you provide to them?
We provide our advice to the federal government, so we have fairly minimal interaction with the state governments.
We do provide advice to state governments when we're asked for it, but we also have state organisations who work directly with their state government, who are interestingly much better resourced than we are at a national level by the state governments. The state governments seem to value the role of peak bodies in a way in terms of resourcing that the federal government never really has, with some exceptions. But we will, I guess the way I would put that is that there are state issues that get discussed between a state peak body and a state government, and then there are national issues which get discussed between a national peak body and a national government, and then there are Commonwealth issues which involve conversations between all of those and local governments as well. So I think as national peak bodies, we are trying all of the time to engage at that Commonwealth level rather than just at the state or the national level.
And if I could give you just two very quick examples, building on what Adrian said. Two of the papers that we did on research, one was about looking at on the CRA, Commonwealth Rent Assistance, and the other one we did on housing for people with disabilities. Both of those reports, we were contacted directly by the head of housing, in this case in South Australia, who's overseeing it's when all the CEOs from the housing organisations or the housing agencies of governments, and they said that they found that those reports were incredibly useful because they've been trying to get a handle on what might be the impact of CRA in their states. And because our reports and the research we do looks at what happens in each state, they're able to do a comparative analysis about how their state compares, what are the kinds of things that they need to look at. So the kinds of work that we do at a national level actually gets used at the state level and by state governments to help inform the kinds of decisions that they need to make.
Okay, thanks very much. In 2013-14, there was no provision in the former Labor government for further funding, as I understand. Is that right? In those forward estimates over that period, 2013-14?
That's for the NPAH. That's our understanding, yes.
Yeah, and that. But last year, I'm just trying to get my head around it. But last year, funding from this government was extended for 1 year.
That's correct.
And what was the quantum?
It was 115 million.
Right.
The year before was, I think, 165 million. It had included a capital component and a research component. So
just take me back to what the rhetoric was around when there was nothing in the forward estimates with the previous government. I mean, what bells were ringing then? I mean, how did you get the 115 million?
The same bells that we're ringing now, and I think all of our organisations, but primarily Homelessness Australia, was involved in campaigning with each of those governments to continue the National Partnership Agreement on homelessness.
So why has there been a successive, with both governments of all persuasions, been a decline? What's been the pressure point for that? Why have governments of previous government, this government, do you think that there's this gradual slide in revenue?
Well, with just to correct that history, Senator, the previous government actually provided an additional $5.65 billion into capital funding for straight public housing or social housing. A lot of it actually was ended up in the community housing sector. It also introduced the National Rental Affordability Scheme, which had a significant budget cost. It also introduced the National Partnership Agreement on homelessness. So they did provide, by my estimation and calculation, an additional $20 billion at least on top of what had previously been in the forward estimates to run out the NPAH. Then the National Partnership Agreements had a fixed term. Initially they were for 3 years. I don't know what happened in that final year of the Labor government that they
Is that
failed
the
to put it into the
$111 million
estimates.
figure, the 13-14? Because that was what the figure was, 111.
Yep.
And then this government provided 115 million.
No, this government provided 115, which was the same 115 for frontline service provision.
Yeah.
The element had been removed was the capital component and the research component for a 5-year project called Journeys Home, which actually ceased at the end of 2013-14 anyway. So that was what was removed. So the actual amount of money for frontline service provision of $115 million remained constant over the 2 individual years.
And also just to add, with the negotiation, particularly of the national partnership agreements, the specific outcome measures that were expected from those were set by the Commonwealth, and the states all had to develop implementation plans at a state level, which were then approved by the Commonwealth. None of the funding flowed to the states until it was actually approved by the Commonwealth. It isn't therefore right to say that the states make their own decisions about what they spend their money on. They do develop their own plans, but those plans needed to be approved by the Commonwealth.
So they allocate the homeless funding programs. So
with matched funding.
Sorry?
With matched funding.
So that what funding do they match?
They were all 50-50 matched funding deals.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for making yourself available, and thank you again, Mr. Quinnell, for also participating with their peak bodies. And I do want to note the incredible contribution you've given to this inquiry, and again, it is for Ms. Crochet and Mr. Basari the second time you're appearing before us, so thank you.